Hello and welcome to Arvos of Harvo for November. It is almost the end of another year, which means that I've almost done 2 full years of this. How strange. And very, very exciting. The very first time in my life, this month, I have finished 100 books in 1 year. That's unbelievable. I never thought I would have ever gotten to this point. And wow, it doesn't make me feel any different. In fact, I may feel slightly worse. Anyways, let's talk about some books. I feel like this month is entirely the month of aesthetic covers. I love the whole blue and yellow thing I've got going on, and it's interesting. I'm getting a bit tired of my categories, I'm going to be honest, but things are fine, things are good, some of these are good. Book number 1, and who would have thought it, it is The Highest Tide by Jim Lynch. This is one of the first books I ever bought with my own money. I bought this at Basement Books in Sydney Central in, when were they still open? It would have been like 2013. The first year I went to university. I went down to this bookstore and I saw they had this big stack of books being sold for $1. And I think my naive self going into a teaching and English degree thought that maybe all books are good, and so even if it's only $1, I'm sure it's fine, right? And then I bought it and I sat on my shelf the entire time. I come back to this for the aquatic category because this is a book about, actually it's about the coast of Washington, which is an interesting setting. It's a place where all sorts of different marine life gather and washes up along the coast, and it's about a young boy who's growing up in this area, and he grows very fascinated and accustomed to the wildlife there. One day he finds a giant squid that's been washed up on the beach, and the media start to scrutinize him. He gets the attention of a local cult. Just a bunch of weird stuff happens, but it's mostly a coming-of-age book, and it's mostly foregrounded on this idea of the ocean. So we followed Miles. Miles is quite socially awkward. He's a young boy, he's adolescent, which means that the usual adolescent themes appear here. Some bits are funny, some bits are sad, but overall, I hate to say this, it's very similar to a lot of other things that come out, right? I can probably name a few things that I've read so far that are just so similar to this. Even with the whole aquatic theme, I can name things like Past the Shallows, things like Cloud Street, lots of different coming-of-age novels about young men growing up alongside the ocean. It's just common. And yes, the uniqueness of this one being from the Pacific Northwest is interesting, but look, this is the horrifying thing, is that I went into this book thinking it would be bad, thinking that a $1 book from a bookstore that has now since closed down very sadly, that they had 30 copies of. They have one big pile of these. And when you see a book like that, you think it's going to be bad. You expect it to be bad, or at least mediocre. And the horrifying thing is that it's not. The Highest Tide is quite good. It's fine. It's a decently written book. There are qualms that I have with it, especially the writing style. I think he just uses too many similes. But aside from that, there's nothing really wrong with it. The themes are interesting, the writing style is easy to get into, the aquatic life is really well researched. In fact, I felt like I learned a lot of things while I was reading this, and it's going to be forgotten. It's going to be a book where no one is going to remember it or talk about it in a few years, and it's so sad to me because it's enjoyable, and I'm sure the author has worked very hard on it and would hate for me to talk about it in these lenses, but it is just that. It's not going to set the world on fire. It's just a nice and quaint and personal story about a young boy growing up alongside the beach. It's fine. It's a 3 out of 5. Okay, book number 2 is Lady Chatterley's Lover. This is, I didn't really know about it, but I had it on my list because eventually I would like to read Cold Comfort Farm, and I don't know anything about Cold Comfort Farm other than it is parodying this style of turn-of-the-century romance novel, of which I was told D.H. Lawrence plays a large role in. I was not expecting to get what I got with this book. Absolutely not. This book, despite being written in the 1930s, is one of the most explicit things I've read. It lingers so much on the act of adultery, the physical act of adultery, and the references to relationships and extramarital affairs is gratuitous in a way that I can't fathom. Like, there's other books that have themes like this that just are not nearly as graphic as this. And I understand that this book, in its originality, was not published until 1960, and Penguin Books, the Orange guys, they got into a big lawsuit about publishing obscenity because of just how extreme this book's content is, and I can see that. It definitely would have ruffled a few feathers back in its day, and to the point where even reading it today in public, it makes me blush. It lingers so much on just... Anyways, we follow the Chatterley family, which is a kind of old money family in England. Mr. Chatterley is a war veteran, so he's come back without the use of his legs, and he is clinging on to the old themes of aristocracy. He is trying to make business and industry in a industrialized part of London, but he is also holding on to the valor that he had as a war veteran and as one of those old family names. Compared to that, we have his wife, Lady Chatterley. Her name's Constance, or Connie. She's a libertine. She's traveled all around Europe, had a liberal education, is quite fiercely independent, well-read, well-educated, and she feels a bit stifled now that she's in this old money relationship with a husband who's she can't have sex with because he's paralyzed from the war. So she, in addition to being his effectively housekeeper and managing the household alongside the servants they have, she develops a relationship with the gamekeeper at the house. And so together they have this tryst where it discusses a lot about social class, because the gamekeeper is also a veteran and in the war was able to transcend the very rigid class systems of the Victorian era, but then comes back into post-war England and is relegating himself to that role. And within that, we have the conflicts of physical desire versus economic prosperity, and really the breakdown of the family after the First World War. And it's a pretty harrowing read, and it's a pretty wise book as well. I went into this not expecting a whole lot, and I was really surprised by just how interesting and philosophical some of the discussions are. I especially like the opening line. The opening line is, "Ours is essentially a tragic age, so we refuse to take it tragically." How interesting is that? And it keeps going. "The cataclysm has happened. We are among the ruins. We start to build up new little habitats, to have new little hopes. It is rather hard work. There is now no smooth road into the future. But we go round or scramble over the obstacles. We've got to live no matter how many skies have fallen." This was more or less Constance Chatterley's position. So we have this protagonist who is making a life for herself after a great cataclysm of World War I, but also her own personal and familial struggles. And just, it's complicated, and I enjoyed it a whole lot more than I thought I would. It weaves together these really complex and high-minded themes really well, so I would give it a 4 out of 5. Book number 3 is Vampires in the Lemon Grove by Karen Russell. This is my own premise, and Karen Russell, I would have said, based on her collection Orange Well, which I read 2 years ago, is one of my favorites fantasy or magic realism writers of the current day. Her work is just so interesting. She has such strange high concepts that just work so well. So out of this book, the two that I remember most vividly are the title story, Vampires in the Lemon Grove, where a pair of vampires in a relationship, neither of them particularly like to suck blood and to feed on humans, and so they travel around the world trying to figure out how they can fight this urge, and eventually they wander upon one specific lemon grove in Italy, in rural Italy, where biting into the lemons gives them a similar sense of satisfaction as biting into a human. And so we explore the relationship of these two vampires through the lens of the lemon grove. It's just so strange and bizarre. We see their connections and relationships with the farmers there. We see the ability they have to try and rein in their status and their condition, and the way that this absurdity affects the pair's relationship as well, the way they relate to each other and the way they see the world around them. And just one more story that I don't think I'm ever going to forget is about a stable of horses who are all reincarnations of the American presidents. It's just so wonderfully bizarre. And what I like about these stories is that despite these crazy premises, they are heartfelt, they're really sentimental, and you feel the emotions even though you're so far abstracted from sense. And I think just Karen Russell does it so well, because you're not expecting to feel things, and then you do. It's great. I did like Orange World a whole lot more though. I think there are some stories in Orange World that just blow the lid off this genre entirely. And Vampires in the Lemon Grove to me feels a little bit more like a proof of concept, I'm gonna be honest. Like, if I scroll back through the list of stories, some of them are genuinely amazing. Some of these stories I love quite deeply. But there are others that, if you had to ask me, I don't know if I remember today. There are some good ones, some really good ones. And so I would give this a 4 out of 5. Highly recommended. If you like magic realism, pick this up, pick up Orange World. I still have a huge amount of respect for this author. I think her work is just unparalleled right now. It's fantastic. Book number 4, and continuing our blue and yellow theme, this is Fates and Furies by Lauren Groff. Lauren Groff also being one of the authors that I admired first when I started coming out of uni, starting to teach high school. Florida was one of the first collections of short stories I ever bought, and I read through Florida, and I love Florida. I still would call that probably a 5-star book, possibly because of sentimental reasons. Like, it was one of the first books of short stories to really make me feel something deep for every short story that I got. And so, going to her novel, Fates and Furies, I'm split, I'm mixed. I have many feelings about this. Barack Obama said this was his favorite book of, I think, 2016, and when I finished reading this book, my first thought was, is Barack Obama okay? Because this is a wild, wild ride. This is a very, very strange book. It's a domestic literary fiction novel in the first half, and then I don't want to say it because I don't like spoiler rules for past half the text, but you really can't talk about this book without spoiling the second half. So, flashing a warning on the screen. The first half is a very standard boy meets girl story. We follow Lotto, who is a young man growing up in a low SES area of Florida, and he falls in love with Mathilde, who is this daughter of an aristocratic sort of family. Lotto is, and I hate this thing. I hate it. Lotto is an author, and Lotto, despite his lower SES, lower social class upbringing, falls in love with Shakespeare. He becomes an actor in his local dramatic society. He goes to uni to study theatre, and he eventually becomes an extremely famous playwright. That, to me, is just so deeply impractical, but it is what it is, right? Authors know about authors, authors write about authors. And so Lotto's story is that he marries Mathilde, and he has a turbulent life full of fame and fortune with her. He writes hit after hit after hit of plays. He lives through his whole life, and he discovers some deep secrets about Mathilde's past that prevent him from fully trusting her, and then his section ends. And then we get Mathilde's section, which winds its way back through the life and the relationship of Lotto, and it's a very non-linear way of going about things. We start to realize details that have always kind of existed behind her story as we met her through Lotto, and her story, I'm just gonna spoil it. If Lotto's story is a domestic literary novel, then Mathilde's story is like Gone Girl. Mathilde's story is like A Little Life. She goes through some things, and the things that she goes through to me were just so unexpected and impractical and exaggerated and gratuitous that it made me really see the novel in a new light and find it very difficult to then go back to the ordinary domestic narrative of the first half. I kind of get what the book's trying to do, is saying that lots of domestic relationships are deeper and more complex than you think. Everyone's hiding something, and there is a underlying theme of Greek tragedy running through this book that I just don't get because I haven't read enough of Greek tragedy. This is a book that is definitely built up of references to the classics, whether it is Shakespeare or the Odyssey or Greek mythology, and I wish I did have more grounding to understand that, but without that grounding, this just becomes a kind of keep you guessing thriller about characters going through really extreme situations and emotions. And I did not like it. I really didn't. I remember reading it on the train towards the end of Mathilde's section and just going, I wish she didn't go there. I wish this book just didn't go in that direction, because It's very different to what I thought it was going to be. It's very different to really all literary fiction that I've read, to start one way and then just totally go somewhere else. I give it 3 stars. I can't really in my right mind recommend it. It's just odd. It's an interesting experiment, but I don't know how I would describe it. I think what I really loved about Florida, the collection, is that it's very human. It's human characters living in a sort of mythologized Florida, and Florida itself is just such a state, right? Whereas Fates and Furies, to me, it's just wild. I don't know. It's just out there. Book number 5, continuing the blue and yellow theme. This is Germinal by Emile Zola. It's a French work of literature, and I did not know anything about it until I went into it. As I find out, it is the plot, or one of the core inspirations for the video game Disco Elysium, which is number 1 on my list of games that I say that I will play one day, and I yet have not. So, Germinal is about a coal mine in France towards the end of the 1800s in the, I did some research and I found out what the period is called, and I don't remember what it's called, but it is the same period of history where Les Mis is set. It's after the French Revolution, but it is still in a time of really stark economic differences between the upper and lower classes. And so we follow mostly Etienne, who is an educated individual coming to the coal mines to find some work, and he finds out that the conditions of the mine are genuinely terrible. People are risking their lives every day and barely making enough money to eat. We see this ensemble of characters trying to make their lives work, going through the mines, making friendships if they can, but also fighting against their superiors, begging for food, and all of the injustices that are laid upon these characters are just laid to bear as well for the reader. It's a very harrowing read. It's really, really sad. And we then see the revolt and uprising of these miners when they try to strike for better conditions and the consequences that arise from that. It's very well written. It's so impactful. There are lots of moments in this text where I almost need to put the book down because I just needed to think to myself about what's going on here. It's so deeply thoughtful and philosophical and political. It explores the desire to rebel against injustice, but also just how difficult it is to make a rebellion stick and to keep it fair and equitable for everybody. We see the transformations of characters once they start seeing the world as something that they can change and seeing violence as a necessary or an inevitable option, whereas before they may have just taken their fate for granted. It's such a complex book, and it's still so relevant to all political discussions that I still see today. I highly, highly recommend it. It's pretty gruesome. It's quite brutal later on. It surprises me with just how forthcoming it is for a book from the 1800s. And I also realized that Emile Zola is a very prolific author who I am deeply jealous of, because he wrote a cycle of novels that's like 28 novels long, and this is part of that big cycle. It is his most well-known work, and lots of people do say it's his best work. I have lots of comparisons between this and The Grapes of Wrath. They're both books that are deeply economical, have an ensemble casts, make you feel strong emotions, but also philosophically and politically explore the themes that they're going for. It's deep and rich and complex, and this one gets a 4 out of 5. Book number 6, this one, I can't believe I finished this. I genuinely can't. This is one of those books where I thought that I would go for my entire life and not bother finishing. This is David Copperfield, Charles Dickens' semi-autobiographical epic novel. It's okay, it's 3 out of 5. Okay, let's talk about it a bit more. So, David Copperfield is just a lot. It starts with the narrator's birth, and okay, it does have those very famous lines. I don't even need to look at the book to know what they are. Whether or not I am to be the hero of my own story, these pages must show, right? Cool, good. But then we get 3 chapters about the narrator being born and the circumstances of his birth, and then we go straight through his childhood, his education, his family, in a very linear sense. If there is any archetypal narrative structure, this book is not it. This book is absolutely not it. I can't believe that the book is just the life of this dude. And David is, for what it's worth, he's someone who's born as effectively an orphan. He doesn't know his family very well. No, I'm totally wrong. He's born to a single mother who then remarries into another family named the Murdstones, and he is treated horribly. And he's sent away to boarding school. He undergoes all of these horrible treatments at the hands of his friend, all his peers, his teachers, his guardians. He gets sent around all around England, and he meets various people and then makes a living for himself, makes a life for himself. He joins not really a legal firm, but he becomes a proctor who, there's not really a corresponding job for that today, but it is somewhere in the legal field. He makes friends, and all the characters that he meets early on come back in some way. The cast of characters in this novel is surprisingly small for how long it is. For a book that's 950 pages, there are about 25 or so relevant named characters, because they keep coming back. If any single character is named and met, you're gonna see them again. And this is, I guess, a very Dickensian trope. It's something that I don't particularly like, because it makes London seem like a university of 4,000 people, when in reality it's a lot bigger than that, right? It's a book filled with coincidences, and I get what Dickens is trying to do. Is he's trying to show change and evolution of individuals over time, but it's just so sprawling with so many different plot threads that none of them feel super impactful. Like, Dickens is a great writer, and he can milk a scene for its emotional worth if he really wants to. And there are definitely moments that I felt quite strongly, but none of those moments are core to what the novel is. There's not really any thread for me that was the core of this novel, as opposed to something like Great Expectations, which I loved a lot more. Great Expectations feels more reined in, and not just because it's half the length, but also because it has core themes and ideas that it latches onto, whereas David Copperfield here is about the narrator. It's about how he grows up and becomes an adult, and the various themes that are core to Victorian England. It has comments on family, comments on marriage, comments on economics and wealth, comments on love and compassion, and all of these other things, but it doesn't have that tight core grounding that makes it mean something. So I did not like this nearly as much as Dickens' other works. In fact, would I say A Tale of Two Cities is better? I really didn't like A Tale of Two Cities. I do think A Tale of Two Cities is better. This also gets a 3 out of 5. Okay, and last book for November, this is Banana Girl by my friend Paris Rosemont. I was very lucky to be able to go to a writing retreat last year, and Paris, among my other friends, were there, and we met and talked about poetry, and it was really cool. And this is her first collection being published by Westwards. Highly recommend, definitely go out and get that before I start talking about it even. This is interesting, and this is very personal poetry, so I genuinely don't know how I can talk about it with my lens of analysis, because I tend to be quite an impersonal critique kind of reviewer, so I'm gonna try my best. I'm not great with talking about poetry. I have not read many poetry collections in my life, and when I do, it's usually because of some ulterior thing, like I read it because I need to teach it or I need to do it for a university course. I've never just bought a collection of poetry and thought, I'm just going to read this. This is probably the second or third time in my life I've ever done that. And so it's hard for me to link up poetry collections as a concept versus individual poems to pick apart and analyze for the techniques. I think that this collection is interesting for its structure and its engagement with classical forms, but also its departure from that. I think it's really quite fascinating because a number of these poems use quite classical forms and classical East Asian forms, which are known for their brevity. So there's tankas, there's haibuns, there's haikus, and there's also things that have images and formatting things and very different approaches to poetry. So I think the internal conflict between these tight, constrained forms of poetry and these expansive new forms of poetry forms a lot of this book's identity. And it is deeply personal. It's exploring ideas of relationships and marriage and moving on from ex-partners and connecting yourself with others within relationships. I think that's quite a difficult theme to write about and not make it sound, I guess,
not make it sound too insular to one person's individual experience, it's quite a hard theme to make work universally. Because, of course, when someone experiences heartbreak, they feel like they're the only person in the world who's ever felt that. And to read poetry that does effectively bridge that gap is really interesting. Poetry that creates empathy. Even though I'm personally very far removed from situations like this, I also really am interested in the idea of the glitch. So I don't know if there's a specific word or concept or term for it. I've just been calling it glitches, where the expected nature of writing dissolves a little bit and you get things that you don't expect, like this poem that has a snakes and ladders game in it. The unexpected quality of that makes the act of interpretation a lot more interesting, because I don't know what the subsequent poem is going to do, whether it is going to use a classical form or whether it's going to almost feel like a choose your own adventure novel, because the words themselves are glitching. They're being unexpected. They're using things like brackets and italics and fonts and other formatting things to be more processed than the word itself. And the fact that these two styles are put next to each other to this extent makes the reading experience quite fascinating. I think that the diversity of this collection is probably what I would remember going from it, and I would give it a 4 out of 5. So that's my 7 books of the month. Thanks again for joining. Only one more month of this before we exit 2023 and we go off into new and strange territories. Thank you again for joining, and I will see you next month.